I want to give an advertisement at the very beginning, and that is all of I'm talking about is made possible by people who volunteered to participate in our research. And so my lab and the Caltech lab and Washington University lab have tables over by the registration area to sign up to participate in research. What you do is sign up, and then if we have a study we're doing, we'd contact you and say, would your person with ACC want to participate in this particular research project? And you can say yay or nay, and so it doesn't obligate you to anything. Eventually, the NODCC will have a registry, and that will make it possible to register one time, one place for everything. But right now, that's not yet in place. And so the birth to 18-year-olds, you want to register at the Caltech, 18 and above at the Travis Institute table where my students and I are. And I'm not exactly sure what kinds of participants the Washington University group is looking for. So that's the advertisement. So I want to talk about basics of the corpus callosum. Actually, I will talk in 3 sections. The first is on the basics of what is a corpus callosum and how do we do research about this. The second part is about a model of what we think the consequences of ACC are. And the last is some new data that we have collected that I think explain a lot that is new over the last 2 or 3 years. The first section of those 3 sections, if you've been to my talks before, will look familiar. The second 2 will be definitely different than what I have presented in the past. Before I get to talking about this, I always like to remind myself and others about the nature of the world we live in with respect to disability. And this is my favorite philosopher, Alistair McIntyre, in a book called Dependent Rational Animals. And he says there's a scale of disability on which we all find ourselves. Disability is a matter of more or less, both in respect to degree of disability and in respect to the time periods in which we are disabled. So in talking about a genesis of the corpus callosum, we were talking about a particular kind of disability, but not a sort of us or them difference, but we are all, according to Alistair McIntyre, on a scale of disability. We're all there somewhere, and we move around from time to time and depending on us. So, getting older, there's certain disabilities that creep up on me that I have to deal with. So the first is just basics, the first third of this talk. And for example, what is a corpus callosum? Corpus callosum is the connective pathway between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So if you look at this illustration, on the bottom left is a whole brain, and that pink colored area, if you dissected through that and looked at the cross section, you would look at what's right above it. And you see a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere indicated. And then in that little box is a corpus callosum. Yes, that's working cool. There's this structure right here that is 200 million neural fibers that interconnect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So it's a big information pathway. It's not where the processing goes on. The processing goes on in the cerebral cortex out here, but this is a pathway that connects processing that's going on in the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So what the corpus callosum does is massively interconnect the right and left sides of the brain. So that cross-section you're seeing there, here's what it looks like in an MRI. And the corpus callosum is that structure right there in the red. It's, again, 200 million neurons that go back and forth between the right and left side that interconnect the right and left cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex. Here's another illustration I like, and the purple is a corpus callosum. What you see on the top is a section which goes right down the middle, and so you're looking at, in purple there, the cross section of the corpus callosum, which is these 200 million neurons that are going back and forth. It's like what you're seeing here is like taking a major cable with many fibers flowing through it, cutting through the cable and looking at the end, and you're looking at a cross section of all of those fibers. Then at the bottom, you're kind of looking down at an illustration of what that means in terms of neurons connections going between the right and left cerebral hemisphere. So we have a massive interconnection between the right and left sides of the brain. All right, so the $64,000 question, some of you who are old as I am will know what that means or where that comes from. The $64,000 question is, what does the corpus callosum do? And just in general, it transfers information between the right and the left side. So across that pathway, a lot of information goes, but it also integrates mental processing on each side so that the things that are processed in the right hemisphere are integrated with things being processed on the left side. And so there's not, for example, redundancy of processing. And it is critical for certain forms of mental processing. And the real big question that I'm interested in is what mental processes are dependent upon the corpus callosum in human brain mental activity. So agenesis of the corpus callosum, the definition of agenesis is a congenital brain abnormality. This you all know. Agenesis means without development. So it's congenitally without development. And therefore part or all of the corpus callosum fails to develop congenitally. That's what agenesis of corpus callosum is. ACC can occur with other brain abnormalities and some significant degree of mental deficiency, or it can be the primary abnormality without other associated brain abnormalities. And in this case, typically persons are more highly functioning. For us in my lab, we use a cutoff of IQ of 80, so 80 or above are the people with ACC we're interested in looking at. And I'll explain that a little more in a minute. There are three forms of abnormal development of the corpus callosum. There's complete ACC, no part of the corpus callosum is present. It is all absent. Partial ACC, some portion of the corpus callosum is present, but not all. And I'll show you that in a minute. And hypoplasia, the corpus callosum is there, but it is thin or notably underdeveloped. So here is just kind of another summary of the same thing. You're looking down at the top of the brain, the left hemisphere on the left, right hemisphere on the right, and if you just sort of artificially pull them apart, then what the corpus callosum is 200 million neurons that go back and forth between the right and left side. Part of the reason for this illustration is there's another pathway called the anterior commissure, and the anterior commissure is 50,000 fibers as opposed to 200 million. And persons with agenesis of the corpus callosum then look like this. The 200 million neurons of the corpus callosum are just not present, but the anterior commissure in most cases is there. So there is communication going back and forth between the right and left side. It's just significantly diminished. And then partial agenesis would look something like this, depending on how much is present and how much is absent. So you have some callosal fibers and you have an anterior commissure, but you do not have all of the callosal fibers. So way agenesis of the corpus callosum looks on midline MRIs is sort of like this. On the left is a ostensibly normal person's MRI. That's mine, and we're not totally sure whether I'm normal, but we'll see. And there in the red circle is my corpus callosum. That white structure looks like the head of a ball pen hammer. So an individual then with agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum, their midline MRI looks like that. So you now have qualified for neuroradiology 101. You can recognize the presence or absence of the corpus callosum. So here's just some other versions of the same thing. There's another person with agenesis, the missing corpus callosum, but we talked about the presence of the anterior commissure. That little white dot is the anterior commissure in cross-section. So there is some minimal connection between the cerebral hemisphere, even in ACC. Then a person with partial ACC, that little white thing in the red circle there, that's part of a corpus callosum. Not a full one, but a part. And then here's another version of partial ACC, and it gives you the idea that partial ACC is not one thing, but there's many varieties of partial ACC depending on how much of the corpus callosum is present or absent. And then hypoplasia looks something like this. You can see the whole stretch of the corpus callosum that's there, but it's thin, and it's just not totally developed. All of those are disorders of the corpus callosum in various varieties. That's the structural thing. I want to talk now and use a metaphor for what this means functionally. So my metaphor is two computers. One computer is the right hemisphere and one computer is the left hemisphere. And two independent computers can each solve the same problem at about the same speed. So you have some amount of processing power and some amount of processing speed in each computer, and therefore in each hemisphere. If you connect them with a small bus, like the anterior commissure, you have two computers linked with a single line that can solve the same problems slightly faster, particularly if they're programmed so that they're sharing a computational problems, one side or the other. But what a brain with a corpus callosum is like is two computers hooked by a massive bus that interconnects the processing of the two. So with two computers linked by a high capacity bus can solve bigger problems faster. So one of the ways I think about what the corpus callosum does for us is allow us to solve bigger problems faster. Greater processing power and faster processing speed. Now, when we do research on agenesis of the corpus callosum, we kind of divide the world up for purposes of clarity and what we're looking at when we do our research experiments. So one group is what's called isolated ACC. That is corpus callosum absent, either partial or complete, only. And these individuals are typically higher functioning versus what I call as ACC plus. That is absence of the corpus callosum plus other developmental brain abnormalities. And these individuals are typically somewhat lower functioning. And the research we do in my lab and also Dr. Paul's lab is focused on, focused on the isolated ACC because being isolated, it allows us to study the impact of absence of the corpus callosum itself without it being complicated by the other kinds of things that might be wrong in that particular individual's neural development. So another way to look at this categories of outcome, isolated ACC gives us some outcome A, whatever that is, what we've been trying to figure out. It's the effect of callosal absence itself. But for the ACC plus, then you're looking at two outcomes kind of confounded. Outcome A, that is the effect of callosal absence itself, and outcome B, which is the effects of other brain disorders. And there's a lot to be done in that research on outcomes A and B right now. In the 20 years we've been, or 20 more years we've been working on this, we've been trying to figure out what is outcome A. That is, what is the outcome of absence of the corpus callosum itself. So now I want to move to part two, and this is a newer part of the presentation. Over the last few years, Dr. Paul and I have sat down and said, look, we've got 20, 25 years of research and specific outcomes in various domains. Can we systematize this in some description of a syndrome? And so we published a paper on the ACC syndrome, which we are trying at least one shot at summarizing the outcome of absence of the corpus callosum. So what you have is the diagnosis, the core syndrome, and the secondary symptoms, at least as Dr. Paul and I organize this. So the diagnosis is obviously agenesis of the corpus callosum, or isolated agenesis of the corpus callosum. And then the core syndrome has three parts to it, we think. One is limited interhemispheric transfer of complex sensory motor information. So there's a certain amount of sensory motor information going on in the right hemisphere and a certain amount going on in the left. And it has to do with different sides of the body and different sides of the visual world and different control of different sides of the body. And that needs to be integrated and coordinated. So that integration and coordination of sensory motor information on the right and left side of the brain is one of the core symptoms. The second core symptoms we think is slowed cognitive processing. So remember in our metaphor of the computers, one of the things that happens when your computers are minimally hooked together or not hooked together, that a particular problem is solved more slowly because each computer is operating on its own. And I'll show you some examples of that. And then a third is deficient processing of complex and novel tasks. This is more like the computing power, that you have less power to solve complex and particularly complex novel tasks. A lot of the high-functioning persons with ACC can do very complex things, but they don't do them well when they're novel, when they've not encountered this before, it's complicated, and they just take somewhat time to figure it out. So, and those lead to, those three general areas of problem lead to a number of secondary symptoms. So we think the other things we've looked at in our research are secondary to those three core problems. What I'll do in a minute is illustrate the core problems. But first, the secondary symptoms, some of those are like, this is not all of them, but inadequate encoding of complex new memories. So when you encounter some information, you need to encode it in some way. That is, you need to think about it in a way that makes it easy to remember. And that is actually a cognitive processing stage that allows you to remember things better later. So you may get a phone number and the area code, you say, yes, that's Pasadena. And so you kind of encode it in a way that it's easy to remember that phone number because at least the area code you've got down. You've encoded it in a way that makes it easy to remember. And that takes some processing when information is very complicated. Problems utilizing previous information, particularly in sequential problem-solving tasks. So problem solving often is you have one part of the problem and then the next part of the problem, and to kind of figure out the next part, you need to use the information from the first part, and to get to the second, third part of the problem-solving steps, you need to make use of information And a couple of the tests we've done, experiments we've done, that we've demonstrated that individuals with ACC have difficulty bringing forward information from previous problem-solving steps. A third is difficulty understanding the secondary meaning of language. So a lot of language has a very concrete, immediate meaning. That's what it means. But also a lot of language communications has secondary meanings. It means more than just the dictionary definition of the words in the statement. For example, idioms, non-literal expressions, require us to think about not just the words that were said, but the secondary meaning of those. Metaphors in language, jokes, proverbs, stories, sarcasm. Sarcasm is a big one. Persons with ACC we've demonstrated have a difficult time understanding sarcasm, particularly complex sarcasm, which means you have to take the statement that the person made and understand it a little bit differently than you would if that were a concrete, direct statement. And then there's deficits in understanding of subtle aspects of social interactions. Social interactions are a complex, novel task almost always, but every social situation is slightly different. It's complicated because there's a lot of things going on, and so persons with ACC, even high functioning, have problems in this area of subtle aspects of social interactions. And lastly, difficulty imagining the consequences of possible actions. So in any particular moment, we may have 2 or 3 options about what to do next. And in order to make decisions about that, I need to think about what are the consequences of doing A versus doing B. And that takes a certain amount of elaborative processing that we'll talk about persons with ACC don't do real well. So back to our model. So this is the model. What I'm going to do is step through those 3 areas quickly, just show you some data with respect to each of those. And then I want to talk more about complex novel problem solving in a different sort of a way. So limited interhemispheric transfer of information, sensory motor. So here's a motor test. You all know the Etch-a-Sketch, right? So one button has vertical and one button has horizontal, and you have to do bimanual coordination in order to do anything on the Etch-a-Sketch. So we had a test where people had to draw a slanting line, and they would draw through that, and we would measure the accuracy and speed with which they were able to negotiate a line on the Etch-a-Sketch. Of course, we did this computer-wise. We created a computer program that did this so we could measure the speed and accuracy of the responses. And we divided these up in a way we thought was really smart and turned out to be irrelevant. We had mirror image movements, and we had parallel movements. So each hand going back. And then we had movements where the left hand had to go faster than the right, in the red. The ones where the right hand had to go faster than the left, in the green, and then the ones where they could go at the same speed. And by and large, with respect to ACC, that made no difference at all. So here's the data. All 6 of those files are on the bottom there, and you can see pretty much the same result. The light bar is the persons with ACC. The dark bar is the controls. And with the exception of the fact that for both ACC and controls, 135, which is near MD at the same speed, it's just really easy. And even parallel movements at the same speed are. But so persons with ACC are, in this case, slower. And if you look at the accuracy measure looks exactly the same. Let me pause to make a comment about these kind of graphs because I'll show you a bunch of them. The top of the bar is the mean or average value for that group of people. But the lines extending above represent something about the variability in that group. So all of these are averages of measures in a group that have variability. And so often the group with the ACC, if you look at the variability in that group, it overlaps with the variability in the individuals with a corpus callosum. So they're mild to moderate deficiencies or differences with some overlap between the group. But it's nevertheless consistent enough to apply statistics, and they tell you that that's a difference between the groups that has confidence, that you can have confidence is a real difference between the group, even though the groups overlap. That makes sense? So you'll see a lot of that in this. So that's motor, so sensory. What we know about the visual system is that it differentiates information from the right and left visual field into the right and left cortex. So our question is, how well can individuals with ACC compare information seen in the right-left visual field, particularly when it's flashed simultaneously and quickly? So in this illustration, let's say you have, here's the middle of the visual field, the visual world you're looking at. And if you're looking there, that's where your eye is fixated. The A will project to the right hemisphere. The left visual field goes to the right hemisphere. And the B will go to the left hemisphere. So there's this crossing. But in the end, you end up with the A in one hemisphere. One hemisphere is seeing A and the other hemisphere is seeing B. So if you're going to compare these, something has to go across the corpus callosum in order for you to make the comparison and say these are the same or different. So we did a number of experiments looking at this ability to integrate information from the right and left visual field when it's presented rapidly. So here's an example, two examples. The person's looking at a white field like that. You tell them to center their point of view on the black dot, and then you flash rapidly something like this. This would be just in one visual field, so even a person without a corpus callosum ought to be able to make that comparison immediately because it's all happening in one hemisphere. It's in the left visual field, so the right hemisphere does the whole thing. But how about a situation like this, where one is in one visual field, one in the other, and to say those are different, you have to have information cross between the two sides. So that's when there was different versions of that, right visual field, left visual field, bilateral, horizontal, bilateral diagonals, all kinds of stuff. But the main difference turns out to be whether it's one in one visual field, one in the other, or both in the same visual field. We also did the same thing with dot patterns. So instead of an A or a B, you had two dot patterns. You had to decide are these the same or different. So the results of this are kind of interesting. On the left, you see the two versions of a letter matching test. And individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum, of course, can do the unilateral one visual field matching test. But interestingly enough, individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum could do with a simple A and B, they could match the two stimuli in the two visual fields as well as individuals with the corpus callosum. So that we didn't expect. But in thinking about that, that is probably the amount of information capable of being passed across the anterior commissure. Was 50,000 fibers up there towards the front. Because it was just A's and B's, and that's all you had to match, and there was not much information that had to be passed between the hemispheres. And then, of course, persons with agenesis could go do the unilateral one side of the visual field matching a dot pattern. But interestingly, they could not do bilateral visual field matching of dot patterns. And I think it's because these are too complex. You had to integrate too much information and pass that information, and the anterior commissure is just not capable of doing that. When we were doing this experiment, we also had access to Roger Sperry's split brain patients. Some of you may know the term, person Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize for work on study of the corpus callosum, mostly in animals, but he also, towards the end of that work, was able to study about 5 or 6 patients who had the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure cut surgically for the control of epilepsy. So you had basically surgical absence of the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure. And persons with surgical split brain could not do that. So there you had a difference, I think, due to the presence or absence of the anterior commissure on what matching tasks you can do and what you can't. All right? So hold on there. I'm sure you probably have questions. We can go back to that. So back to our model. That was the left one, the limited interhemispheric transfer. How about slowed cognitive processing? The standard intelligence test that everybody uses and refers to when they name intelligence is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And it's a subset of about 11 or 12 different tests that kind of come together, and you sort of average all the performance and you say the person has 105 IQ. And it's a bunch of tests. And but you can factor those tests out into some grouping. And one of the ways to group those is into the verbal comprehension index, the perceptual organization index, the working memory index, and the processing speed index. And as you can see, the normal, or the norms on the test would be at 100. And so the dot is the average for the group with ACC. And this is the variance, as you know. And the only one that really is beginning to fall below normal is the processing speed index on the right. So that suggests to us that processing speed may be an important part of the core syndrome. An interesting, another place we saw that is and there's a cutoff score, so they're not quite at the average, not quite at the level that you would on the way say that's a clear abnormality, because it's really not down there to the abnormal cutoff score. But we see this other places as well. So this is a test that's interesting. It's a test of an executive functioning called the color word interference test, and in a battery called the DCAPS. That's an acronym for the persons who developed the test. So there are 3 versions of it. This is all shown in one clump, but you get a card, and the card has color words on it, like at the top there. And all you're supposed to do is read as quickly as you can and as accurately can the words. So you would read red, blue, green, red, blue, red, red, blue, green, so forth, as quickly as you can. And you time them. Then the next card you get has color patches on it. And now your test is just to read the color patches. So you would say red, blue, green, red, blue, red, red, green, and blue, so forth. But you time them on that test. But the real executive function one is at the bottom, the 3rd card you get, and that it has color words printed in a different ink than the word name. And you have to ignore the word and say the color of the ink, which is kind of hard to do. And it slows you way down. So you would be saying, I think it's blue, green, blue, blue, red, green, green, blue. No, see what you do? You just tend to lapse into reading the words. So it takes a certain amount of cognitive control. And our question was, is that kind of cognitive control difficult for persons with ACC? Well, it turns out not particularly. That is, this is a timed score, and it's expressed in what's called scale scores. So the norm on the test is a scale score of 10, and the red bars, which are the controls, have averages right at the test norm, which is what you would expect. Persons with ACC are in the blue bars, and they have lower scale scores. On the color naming and the color reading, they're as low as that sort of inhibition test, the cognition, the speed and control version. You can ignore the fourth pair of bars. It's a more complicated version. We don't have to. So if you look at that as a neuropsychologist, you say, well, the problem isn't so much in cognitive control. The problem is in just cognitive speed, that at every one of those subtests, the persons with ACC are moving, processing more slowly. And so that's another indication that we think indicates that processing speed is a core problem in ACC. So back to our model, we've done the interhemispheric transfer and the processing speed issue, talk a little about deficient, complex, and novel problem solving. So here's one problem solving task we used early on. It's the letter and number series test. There's two versions, letter series and number series. So the letter series would be something like this. This is an easier version. You get a number of these that get harder and harder, and you're given a series of things, and your question is, what is the next in the series? So if the series is A, B, C, A, B, D, A, B, E, A, B, D, right? So, and then they become much more complex to where you can get some scale for how well a person does these letter and number series tests. And the number series is similar. There's 1, 4, 3, 2, 5, 4, 3, 6, 5. Very simple one there, but they get much more complex and mathematical in the series. And so you just see how far a person goes and how well they do. And this is the number of correct in the letter series and the number series. The blue bar is the persons with ACC and the red bar is control. A very significant problem in the ability to do the number series test, which is a novel problem solving task that they just don't do quite as well at. That DCAPS test that we talked about before also has a card sorting test where you have a bunch of cards and they have symbols and numbers and colors on each card. So you might have X's and there are 3 X's and they are in red. And another card may have 3 X's and they're in blue, and another card may have dots instead of X's. And so you have to sort the cards some way. You can sort by number, you can sort by color, you can sort by the symbol on the card. And you see how many different sorts a person can make. But more interestingly, you can do the sorting and sit there and sort cards, and the person has to recognize on what basis you are sorting the cards. And that's the one, the sort recognition description with the red star there is the one that individuals with ACC have the most problem with. The black line at the top is the normative mean, and the persons with ACC are below it. So it's another version of a problem-solving task than individuals with ACC have to do. So the third part of this test, I want to talk about elaborative thinking in isolated ACC. And this is, in terms of our model, kind of focused on the area of what do we mean by novel problem, complex novel problem solving, what domains, what is this like, what is the core problem even in that area. So we did one test that we got from Fulvius Castelli, an animations test. This is used with persons with autism, and a very good test. There's one version that's just random movements of the 2 little triangles, and that's not very interesting. They watch this for a minute or 2, and then you just ask them, what did you see, or describe what you saw. And then there's versions of this that are what is just called goal-directed. So there is something to describe there, but it's very minimal. So one's following the other. That's not all there is to be said. And those are interesting, but those are the kind of control comparison. The most interesting is what's called theory of mind. And in this, the two triangles interact in ways that connote social interactions in an important way. And the question is, does a person pick up on those implications or inferences that one might make? So I'll just show this to you so you understand what comes later. There are 4 different versions of this. This one's called surprise. Now, when you see that and you're asked to describe what you saw, generally people describe that with inferences about social interactivity, emotions, cognitive process, mental processes going on in each of the triangles as they interact with one another. What's interesting about this test prior to our use of it was persons with autism give you a very depleted description without much in the way of emotion content, cognitive content, or social content. So we were interested in how do persons with isolated ACC do on this test. And when you run the test, you get a text back. They tell you something and you transcribe it. And then once you transcribe it, once you write it down, you can transcribe it. And as soon as you have transcribed text, you have something that's useful with what's called computational linguistics. So computational linguistics is a new field developed over the last few years. Things like Siri and Alexa use computational linguistics to understand what you have said and what the semantic meanings of it. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in this field. We used a thing called topic modeling, where you take a text and you extract from it what are the topics, the main topics in that text. And it gives it to you in groups of words that represent, oh yeah, there were 3 main topics in this text, and there they are. So what we took is we had 14 individuals that had a corpus callosum, and we put the text from all 14 of those into one big file, and we did a topic modeling with that file. So this was sort of the topics that all the controls together use in their expression. So that was kind of our core response. And then our question was, and in topic modeling, you can take the topics or the expressions of any particular individual and compare it to the cortex. So our question was how, for each person, each of the 14 persons with ACC, how close was their response to the core response? And there's a term called perplexity, and perplexity is basically how different. Was this really very much like the cortex, or was this like different from the cortex? All right, so we had 14 individuals with ACC. We had 13 individuals with autism spectrum disorder, and we had 14 individuals that were controls that had a corpus. How would you expect this to come out? Persons with ACC, would they have high perplexity? That is, they would be very different from the control model, or would they have low perplexity? They would be very much like the control model. I had it wrong. So in thinking about this before we actually got the data back, I was kind of expecting to see that individuals with ACC would tell you a story that would be different than the core model. And in fact, it turns out to be very robustly the opposite. So look at the bars on the right there. That's that surprise one that you just looked at. And the individuals with the corpus callosum had much higher complexity scores. That is, their story, what they told you about that was different, more different than the control cortex, than the persons with ACC or the persons with autism, which are these two. So when thinking about that, I began to realize persons with ACC in this thing are getting the core thing. They're kind of getting the basic thing that went on there. What they're not doing is giving you a story that elaborates on that. That tells you, imaginatively elaborates on what was going on here. And so the perplexity, the difference, is very much higher in the controls because they elaborate. Make sense? So we had another data set that I said, oh wow, that's pretty interesting. Let's see if it works in this other data set. So this is a test called the thematic apperception test, and you put one of these black and white cards, one of them in front of a person, and you say to the person, I want you to tell me a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Tell me what the characters are thinking, feeling, and doing. And so they tell a story, and you write down everything they say and transcribe it. And again, you have texts that are ready for computational linguistics and topic modeling. So we did the same kind of thing. There were 6 different pictures, and for each picture, we calculated the control model for all the controls together. This time, we did not have an autism group, but we had now 26 individuals with ACC and 30 controls, and we compared it to that control model and got exactly the same thing, very robust, same thing on all 6 cards. The persons with the corpus callosum have greater perplexity. That they tell you a story with a lot of variance from the core. They get the core, but they give you a lot more than that. Another version of computational linguistics is what is called linguistic inquiry and word count. And this is a analysis program that takes words and classifies them into semantic categories. So you know what kind of things what kind of semantic issues they talked about and what they didn't. And there were 3 areas that persons with ACC used fewer words than the control individuals in that thematic apperception test. Persons with ACC used fewer words about emotions and feelings of the characters. They used fewer words about the mental processing of the characters, what the characters might be thinking or what's going on in their minds. And they used fewer words with respect to social interactions of the characters. So my thinking now, we republished this model. What I just showed you is research we've done since then. So I'm thinking that either deficient, complex, novel problem solving has got to be generalized in something about elaborative thinking, or else we need to add another box there. I'm not sure. So just to tell you the way I'm thinking about this, we have some related contexts. One is the idea of problem solving in itself. But problem solving takes some imagination. That is, to solve a problem, you got to figure out what are the steps in this problem and how might I go about solving it. And that takes some elaborative thought and inference. You have to elaborate around what is given you in order to solve the problem. But that imagination is also the kind of thing that goes into creativity. So I think there's something now beginning to percolate in my thinking about ACC in terms of elaborative thinking and creativity, not just sort of captured entirely by problem solving. Creativity is more than has both the idea of divergent thinking of a lot of different wild ideas, and thinking and ideas that are problem relevant. And I think creativity here, I'm using it as more the latter, problem relevant generation of ideas. We're running low on time, so I'm going to pass that. So that's what I'll have to say about agenesis of the corpus callosum, and I'll take your pardon? Okay. But before I do, I want to read again from Alistair McIntyre, who I started with. And I think this, Alistair McIntyre expresses well what NODCC is all about. And so McIntyre says, "For it is a common assumption that blindness, deafness, deformed or injured limbs, and the like, including agenesis of the corpus callosum, exclude the sufferer from more than a very, very limited set of possibilities. And this has often been treated as if it were a fact of nature. What is thereby obscured is that the extent to which the obstacles presented by those afflictions, like ACC, can be overcome or circumvented depends not only on the resources of the disabled, but also on what others contribute. Others whose failures may be failures of imagination with respect to future possibilities. What disability amounts to, that is, depends not just on the disabled individuals, but on the groups of which that individual is a member, including the NODCC. So those are the groups that I work with, the scientific groups. And so we have some time for, okay. We got time for questions. This is good. Yeah, I've gone on 54 minutes, it tells me here. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is whether or not these cognitive things plateau in some way as an adult. I think the answer is yes and no. And to the degree that you're talking about some domain of life, which is a constant push on complex, novel problem solving, I think that they don't necessarily get better at that. I think what they get better at is domains in which that's no longer novel. It may be complex, but it's no longer novel. They do it a lot, and they can develop sort of habitual skills and ability to do that. And there they don't necessarily plateau. They can get better and better and better. I don't know if you know who Sam Richards is. I hope he's okay with me telling you this. Sam Richards is one of the persons here with isolated ACC, and he's on the way to compete in the National Rubik's Cube Championship. And he's going to give a seminar on Rubik's Cube at this conference. So Sam's been doing Rubik's Cube ever since I've known him, and he's just developed expertise, and he's not plateauing on this. He's getting better and better. But it's a habitual skill. It's not a complex novel task. Does that make sense? Yeah. The question is, with respect to what plateaus, and see if I got your question right, is there ways to intervene in ways that keep, the thing going? And first of all, that is just not known in any research way. So I can't, as a researcher, answer that question. What I can do is tell you what, as a researcher who's been studying ACC, what I think. And I think that the best interventions are going to be, at least from what we know now, those kind of interventions that try to take complex, novel things and move them into the area where they're no longer novel for them. So one of the areas that they have problems with is social skills, that's understanding social nuances. There is treatments used in autism that is sort of explicit social skills training. normally with like adolescents and young adults, where we don't, as family members, do much explicit. It's a little more subtle than that. But the treatments used in autism are very explicit in order to try to move social skills into the domain of the habitual. They're not trying to figure out this. Now, that's not totally successful because social situations are variable for sure, but it does help them learn social skills. So one of the persons that, I don't think she's at this meeting, but a long conversation with one of the persons with ACC was telling me how her family used to have little signals for her to signal when she's talking too much or talking too loud, or, they kind of give her a little signal. And by that, she began to learn much better how to react in situations in socially appropriate ways. And it's great because she has ACH. She was telling me all this. It's like, okay, yeah, that's kind of what I expected. So that, there's just that in the treatment area, there's just a ton that needs to be done yet. And it's hard research to do. And part of the reason cooperation in terms of research is so important, because you need to do the same treatment with a large group. And any kind of intervention is not going to be a one-shot deal. It's more likely to be a lot of sessions. And so you need a lot of people over a lot of sessions in order to do a decent intervention study. And that's really hard research to do. And so, maximal cooperation by the people at NODCC, for example, in trying to organize those kind of research studies will eventually be necessary. So the criteria for being in our studies, and therefore those that are represented in what you saw, is 18 years old and older, so these are adults, have an IQ of 80 or above, so they're functioning in the generally normal IQ range, and have no other clearly obvious brain disorder on an MRI or functional disorder like epilepsy. So if you rule those out, then those are the people that you just saw me talking about. Yeah. We haven't. In terms of, I think it's a really interesting question about aging and ACC, like 60 years and older, and what is that going to be like? Dr. Paul is doing the child development part of this, so she's studying kids from about 1 year old up to 15, 16, 17, and looking at the age development process, and finally has a large enough group to start analyzing the data and figuring out what's going on, and is showing some really interesting things in the early childhood years. Even it's kind of interesting to me that even what they're showing, even up to about 3 years old, this I would not have expected, but they are showing the same kinds of difficulties in social and not so much in motor, but in social and cognitive sorts of things that differentiate persons with ACC and persons with a corpus callosum. So, yeah, this is one of the big questions. Neurofeedback means, the question is, does neurofeedback help? Again, I don't know any data that said it would or would not. Neurofeedback is basically taking some measure of neural activity like an EEG and algorithm or whatever, using that feedback in order to help a person either control their states by their cognitive states by neural feedback, or by using that to that information to present information maybe that they need to learn so that their learning state. I don't know enough about that field in general, and I'm 99.9% certain there's no work been done with ACC with respect to neurofeedback. In the domain of a lot of these therapies, we're unfortunately in the world of anecdotes. You know, somebody tried it, it worked. Well, I'll try it, see, maybe it works with my kid. And the scientists will say the plural of anecdote is not data. The data is collected more systematically. You don't just pool anecdotes, but that's kind of where you start. You hear that certain kinds of things work. Yeah. What neuroplasticity refers to is the brain cellular organization is dynamic. That is all the time, it's forming new synapses. Interestingly enough, more or less myelin on those fibers, like the ones going through the corpus callosum, that actually changes over hours. This actually is something that's been shown in the last few years, and it totally shocked me. I thought that was. So the point about neuroplasticity is the brain is very dynamic. But we know about neuroplasticity to start with because everything that happens to you that you remember, for example, you remember because of neuroplasticity. That is, new connections are made in the brain, and your brain reforms itself slightly in ways that are plastic. So the question that they were talking about is, are there major major changes in things in the cerebral hemispheres when the callosal fibers aren't there? And that would just be one of hundreds of dimensions of neuroplasticity. That's what it means. This relates to one of my pet peeves. So I'll tell you my pet peeve. I hate the statement that X thing you do changes your brain. And the reason I hate it is everything changes your brain. We have plastic brains. Everything we learn, everything changes your brain. So that statement to me means nothing whatsoever. Because, yeah, you have great. I am not a physician, so I can't answer that, whether that a syndrome is secondary or primary. Again, the distinction is whether when you look at the brain in MRI, absence of the corpus callosum is the only thing you see. And then we add one other criterion to that. Is the person functioning generally in the normal IQ range, which suggests that there's less things otherwise going on? So that would be the criterion, but that particular disorder, I don't know. Again, you have to ask that's a question to ask Elliot Scher, because that's the domain he deals with, and he can tell you absolutely the answer to that. I wouldn't venture an answer because I don't know. That's not my area. Thank you. Yeah. Question is there a difference in the outcome depending on the degree of agenesis, which means basically partial versus complete? Yeah. The interesting thing that has been surprising to us, in every study, we have some people with complete and some with partial, usually about 20-25% with partial and the rest of them with complete. But we always statistically analyze the difference between partial and complete. And in most of the studies we've done, there has not been a difference between partial and complete. The one exception to that is a dissertation just being completed by one of my students looking at the ratings of adaptive behavior by a family member of the person with ACC. So they look at, there's this big rating scale on this, you know, how a bunch of different areas of adaptive behavior. And the ratings of adaptive behavior are worse in the persons with partial than the persons with complete in this study. Whereas in most of the stuff we've looked at prior to this, we don't see that very often. They look the same. And yeah, so I don't think it's better, which surprises me. I would have thought if you have some corpus callosum, that's better than none, and that you'll actually do better. But another thing that is has to be taken into consideration is when there's a partial corpus callosum, partial agenesis, those fibers are not necessarily going where you would expect them to go if it was that part of a whole corpus callosum. In fact, they're going different ways and in ways that are mostly unpredictable. There is one predictable pathway through partial. So it's not like, having part of a normally connected corpus callosum. It's like having a totally different kind of interhemispheric interactions that for some things may be the same as absence of the corpus callosum. Some things may actually confuse things. I don't know, but we're surprised. I've from the very beginning, I thought in this that partial would give you better outcome than complete, and we just almost never see it. Yeah. No, we have not studied persons with hypoplasia in any consistent way. They are rarer, and so it's harder to form a group. And I was thinking we may have one or two in our database that have hypoplasia, but it's not enough to really study. That is to think about what hypoplasia might mean in all of this. I think there's some degree, and the one question is to what degree, there's some degree that what I've talked about with isolated high function ACC, that is part of disorders of the corpus callosum throughout. The questions would be what other things are happening in the context of that person's brain function that contribute to their particular syndrome, and what kind of a callosal disorder is it? So hypoplasia, I wouldn't expect to show some of this or all of it, or I'm not entirely sure. It's a really good question. There's so much more to do. Yep. The question, if I got it right, is there any evidence for or against earlier starting a therapy, that is when you get a diagnosis earlier? And again, that's just an area there's no work. And, you would expect earlier interventions, like if you're trying to help a child with, if you're trying to help a child with, let's say, basic school skills, I think the earlier you start with that, the more chance you have of making those repetitive and not novel, so that when they get into school and all of a sudden they're dealing with reading, this is not a novel thing. This is something that I've dealt with, and therefore I have some basis for encountering this, rather than it being just a complete complex novel problem that I'm having a hard time figuring out. So again, there's nothing scientifically, unfortunately, on the intervention diagnosis. Yeah. We started one intervention study a couple of years ago, and the graduate student was doing it, left, and we didn't get it finished, and so we got to go back to that. But no, yeah. Where's my research? I'll tell you where my research is going. There's a lot of researchers here. There's Linda Richards, who does cellular brain development stuff. There's Elliot Schur, that does genetics research. Dr. Lynn Paul's doing child development stuff, and I'm doing the consequences for cognitive functioning in adults. Where I'm going is this idea of inferential elaborative thinking as a part of ACC. I've got 4 students looking at empathy, at appreciation of art and music, and the processing of moral dilemmas. So there are all these moral dilemmas, which ought to have something to do with understanding consequences in the future. And the empathy thing ought to have something to do with your ability to elaborate around what you're seeing in the picture to understand what it is that's going on that I might empathize with. And so that's where I'm going. I'm right now particularly interested in this idea of collaborative thinking. Another place, I'll give you one more. Another place, we're going back to that first stuff on visual field comparison. Things going on the right and left visual field. We're trying to develop an online test that can be used, and that is tricky because you have to have millisecond reaction time data over an online system, which is tricky, but we think we solved it. Because I think that if what we have learned in ACC is starting to describe what a corpus callosum is for, what it does for us, then one of the things we know is the corpus callosum is developing during child development, particularly develops between, in terms of myelinization and thickening, between early school age and about 12 years old or 13 years old, which is all the period of time in which we worry about developmental readiness for math or developmental readiness for and so we're hoping we can develop a very sensitive test of callosal transfer efficiency that is applicable to people who have children who have a corpus callosum to decide, compared to the rest of their peers, how is their corpus callosum functioning, and does that have any implications for how readily they're going to pick up math, for example. Math is one of the areas that persons with ACC just have a hard time with. And it may be that kids with a corpus callosum have a hard time because they're starting math too soon. Their corpus callosum is not ready to start math. They need more efficient. I don't know how that'll come out, but that's kind of what we're thinking about where we might go. Yeah. Yes, our questions are about the normality and accuracy of their emotional assessments of music. We're using a thing. There's like 25 different small short passages of music. They listen to them. They wrote them. They rate what kind of emotion they had and how intense that emotion was. That's where we're doing now. But we are running a study that goes along with that on your basic ability to understand rhythm and pitch and things like that, which we don't expect to be problematic, but you need to make sure that that's normal in order to interpret the musical stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the question. So the question is, persons with ACC often will confabulate. That is, they give you a report of something they think they remember that they actually don't remember. But I don't know that that's necessarily creativity. I think that's pulling from previous memories, and all of us confabulate, actually. That is, when we go to remember some situation, there's some elements that we remember accurately. And we also know that those elements occurred in this context. And so when we tell the story, we confabulate all the things that were probably going on. And we're sure that this is true, but if you actually check on it, we have some very anchored memories, but we also, well, a person that confabulates is doing the same kind of thing. They just don't have access to anchored memories. And so it's a way of processing information out of our memories that we all use that is sometimes less. So there's one situation that happened here at NODCC where I was talking to a person, an older adolescent with ACC, and he was telling me a story about going to a Chicago White Sox game. His mom comes up and said, "What are you talking about? You've never even been to Chicago." And it was a confabulation, probably out of what he watches a lot of sports on TV, probably watch Chicago White Sox games on TV, and was telling me this whole confabulation story that really wasn't anchored in facts, but wasn't all that different than the kind of stories we all tell. We just hope that they're more anchored in facts than. So I don't know how that relates to elaborative thinking and the kind of stuff we get. That's a really good question. Yeah. So the question is about how would this information impact advocating for a child with ACC and the IAP thing. Just about what I said. I think the accommodations that are necessary are, for example, I would advocate that the parent get at home good advance notice on what information is going to come up in classroom. So you can have your child prepared, so this is not too novel. They processed a little with you. And then just, if processing time is slow, then taking tests is going to take more time. Those are just ones I think of off the top of my head. I think that's what the kind of things I would ask for. Yeah. Let's go that way. So the front and then back. Yeah. Question about research on expressive language. Only in the semantic sense. So that, language has a lot of parts. And the stuff we did on the animations and the stories they tell were questions about the semantics of expressive language. Do you talk about the same kind of things? But there's all kinds of other things. There's things about, syntax and phonology, and I don't know of anything in those areas. So. All right, I think we're pretty well wrapped up.